Welcome to Communist of America podcast. Our Class War 2024 campaign is well underway. We're hitting the streets, bringing this message that the Democrats and the Republicans are parties of the ruling class, parties of the rich, of the billionaires, and that we need to build a communist party that actually represents working class interests. And we've gotten a very positive response to this. However, we are certainly encountering the argument that no matter who it is, no matter what, we need to vote against Trump, which of course means a lesser evil vote for the Democrats, because Trump represents a danger to American democracy. And if he comes to power, basically, we would have fascism. And so in this episode, Bryce and I are going to discuss what Trumpism actually is, where it comes from, and whether Trump is a fascist or not, whether there's a fascist movement behind him, and how we can actually combat Trumpism as communists and fight for a revolution in this country. So,
Right. Well, I think the first thing to say off the bat is that Trumpism is not a fascist movement. And the reason we're discussing this, the reason we insist on clarity and precision here, is because as communists, we need to have an accurate prognosis for where society is heading. And definitely, Trump is obviously not a normal bourgeois politician. There's no question that he's a chauvinist, he's a reactionary. Communists oppose him, communists fight him. That goes without saying. But I would say those kinds of politicians have always been present under capitalism. And so I wouldn't say that alone indicates that fascism is on the horizon in the US. And I think above all, we really have to look beyond surface impressions to deal with this topic. Because as we'll discuss today, if we characterized Trumpism as a fascist movement, it would mean something very specific. Very different political conclusions would flow from that. And so, yeah, it is important. It's a key question in US politics. And I would say if you don't understand what Trumpism is, you can't understand where US society is headed.
absolutely. And that's also why the centerfold in our latest issue of The Communist, issue number 5, is an article precisely on this question authored by Bryce. And the point is, the reason why we need to understand what this phenomenon is accurately is precisely to know how we can fight it, because the whole point is you want to have the correct diagnosis so you can have the correct medicine really to solve this disease in the US. And so, yeah, let's get right into it. You already said Trump is not a fascist. I guess why not?
Yeah, well, I think a good place to start is by looking at what fascism was historically. And it's been over 80 years since fascism came to power in Italy in the 1920s, and then in Germany and Spain in the 1930s. And so at this point, many people use the word fascism very loosely, very unscientifically. And that's understandable. But as Marxists, we need to strive for clarity here. We need to study history and society in a scientific manner. And so we need to be precise in how we define these things. The aim of fascism historically was to completely physically destroy the labor movement, to crush socialist consciousness, to atomize the working class entirely. And the fascists did this in the interests of the capitalist class. The capitalists had basically decided it was necessary in order to restore stability after a period of class struggle, of instability. And so they turned towards the fascists as kind of a last resort to stabilize their system. And I think it's helpful to concretize it, to use the example of Germany, since that's what many people are most familiar with. But I would say the same fundamental process played out in Italy and Spain as well. And so just to kind of maybe give a glimpse of like what did the Nazis do upon coming to power? They came to power in March 1933. And right before that, for decades really, the German labor movement had been the strongest and best organized in the world. There were 7 million members of the trade unions. There were, in the German Communist Party, the KPD, had around 300,000 members before Hitler came to power. The Social Democratic Party, basically the reformist socialist party, at its peak had over 1 million members. And there were even millions in armed labor defense organizations as well. And so a strong, well-organized, historically militant labor movement in Germany. And the fascists' very first priority was to destroy that, to legalize the Communist Party, legalize the Socialist Party, legalize the unions, and crush these things physically. So in March 1933, the KPD, the Communist Party, was immediately legalized. And the Nazis confiscated all of their offices, all of their assets. And then over the next few months, they basically systematically um, destroyed all remaining traces of the labor movement. On May 2nd, the trade union offices were occupied and turned into so called houses of German labor, so like a state run labor institution, but not independent unions. On May 16th, the right to strike was abolished. The federations of unions were also dissolved. Soon after, the trade unions themselves were officially reorganized, in other words, resolved. Their funds were confiscated. Their leaders were loaded onto trucks and taken to concentration camps. On June 23rd, the SPD, the Reformist Socialists, was also banned and all its leaders arrested. And then on July 14th, a new law was decreed, which basically said that the Nazi Party constitutes the only political party in Germany. And the very first concentration camps the Nazis built, in fact, were specifically for political prisoners, mostly communists and also social democrats and trade unionists. And so I think all of this shows really what the essence of fascism was.
I'd like to quote Trotsky from an article that I believe he wrote in 1934 titled Fascism and Bonapartism, which I would recommend all of our listeners read. It's pretty short and very, very good. And he defines fascism as a specific means of mobilizing and organizing the petty bourgeoisie in the social interests of finance capital. And so we're talking about the ruined petty bourgeois, dissatisfied, impoverished petty bourgeoisie, small business owners, all of this, as well as declassed elements, lumpen proletariat, right? Petty criminals, people on the fringes of society being mobilized on the basis, yes, of populism and demagogy, but for a specific aim, which is they're mobilized and armed to physically crush, to annihilate, to destroy, literally kill the working class, its organizations, its institutions, the trade unions, its parties, and to demoralize them and basically remove any possibility of working class organization and fight back. And therefore, in that sense, that's where it serves the interest of capitalism and of finance capital. And I think it would be helpful also to look at the numbers from Spanish fascism after a long and bloody civil war that started in 1936, from 1936 to 1939. And then dictator Franco came to power on the basis of mass graves and hundreds of thousands of people killed. I have some numbers here, which I would recommend if you want to read more about the Spanish Civil War and the rise of Spanish fascism. There's a book titled Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain by Felix Mara, which is very, very good. But during the war, the fascists killed around 100,000 people in a systematic campaign where they would go from city to city, from town to town, and murder the left-wing side, the working class side in the war. 500,000 people were arrested after the war and sent to concentration camps, which included hundreds of thousands that were forced to perform forced labor. And then also generally after the war, between 1939 and 1942, 200,000 workers and peasants were executed by firing squad, 200,000. I would assume most of them without trial or anything. They would just round it up, shot and killed. 300,000 went missing, meaning a lot of them are in mass graves buried. And to this day, by the way, there's laws in Spain that prevent you from actually unburying the corpses of those that were killed by fascism. Close to 500,000 people went into exile after the seizure of power from fascism. And of those people who went into exile, by the way, 12,000 of them later on ended up in Nazi concentration camps. So that is the social toll of fascism, of a fascist takeover, and what the threat of fascism actually represents.
Right, and that really shows another thing about fascism that's unique about it is that it has a mass base to enforce reaction, to enforce the needs of finance capital. And so both, the examples from Spain and Germany show that this really was a systematic campaign to destroy the labor movement in every building, in every workplace, in every school. There was a network of spies and informants to enforce this. Even reading, say, like an anti-Hitler newspaper could get you imprisoned. In fact, potentially even knowing that your neighbor was doing that and being caught not informing the Nazis on that might also get you imprisoned. So that's a extremely intense authoritarian dictatorship. The SPD, by the way, in Germany, the Reformist Socialist Party, almost ceased to exist entirely. The KPD was drastically reduced by like over 90% of its membership. There was actually a report on underground work from the people who did continue building the KPD. And it mentioned that in one borough in a large town, which used to have several thousand members, it had been reduced to just 8 or 9 party members. And again, the capitalists funded all of this to restore stability for their system. For instance, in Germany, wages were frozen. The work week rose by 20% over the next few years. Um, and so, yeah, it's, contrast that, for instance, to the first 4 years under Trump. It's an extremely different scenario. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the German Revolution and the rise of fascism, which was made possible due to its defeat, I highly recommend also the book Germany 1918 to 1933 by Rob Sewell. It's a very detailed overview of the whole lead up to the rise of fascism in Germany.
Yeah, so if we compare what you just described with, like you said, the first 4 years of Trumpism, it's a very different scenario. If we were on the verge of a fascist takeover today, I think it might be hard for us to even record this podcast here right now. It would be hard for us to have our newspaper titled "The Communist." I think that's why it's important that we have a sense of proportion with all these things, and like you said, accurate analysis of what is happening today, because the liberals are absolutely scaremongering and they're talking about fascism, the threat to democracy, all of this. The Atlantic published an article titled, "Why Aren't We Talking About Trump's Fascism?" Which it's funny because people are talking about it, so I don't think it's any hidden thing here. But they're also making a big deal about things like Project 2025. They say that this is the project for fascism in the U.S. Basically, there was a big ad. Maybe we can show a photo of it. A DNC sponsored ad that said, "Trump's plan to be a dictator on day one. Project 2025. Google it," right? So we actually published, by the way, an article on issue 5 of our newspaper, The Communist, where John Lang, the author, did a deep dive on this topic.
Despite all the liberal scaremongering about Project 2025, it's decidedly not a blueprint for fascism. We know whoever wins in November is going to attack the working class. That's a given. But if you look at how Project 2025 sees attacking the working class, they're not really looking to mobilize, petty bourgeois elements within that Trumpist coalition to go physically attack and destroy working class organizations. If you look at what they say about the public sector unions, they've got lots of criticisms. They say, having public sector unions may not even be compatible with constitutional government in the first place. But they don't then go on to say, so we're going to use the Trumpists or even use the executive of the capitalist state to go and smash these unions. No, they punt the ball to the most toothless branch of government. And they say Congress should consider whether public sector unions are appropriate in the first place. They don't even, go out and just say Congress should ban them. It's like, consider whether they're appropriate. When you look at what Project 2025 has to say about the private sector unions, it's mainly the same old attacks. And the same attacks that we can expect under a Kamala Harris administration. Using the NLRB and using the capitalist court system to make it as difficult as possible for unorganized workers to get organized. But alongside this, they also have this kind of moderate, very mild program of pro-worker reforms, stuff like increased paid time off and more on-site child care, which they kind of pose as being, pro-family reforms. But even if you look at the chapter on private sector unions, there are 9 different minority reports that come throughout the chapter. They're called the alternative view. And the alternative view is always arguing against this, saying, We don't just want to make it harder for unorganized workers to get organized. We want to attack workers who are already organized, right? We don't want this extremely mild program of pro-worker reforms. The American working class, they already have it too good. They're too highly paid. The conditions are too good. They don't need it. This just goes to show the incredible disunity among the hodgepodge of conservative intellectuals and organizations that the Heritage Foundation has brought together in Project 2025. So on a question like trade, which is a huge issue for the Trumpists, protectionism and everything, they have two different chapters. One advocating protectionism, one advocating free trade, which is totally dead letter in the Trumpist party. On Ukraine, they have not two but three competing options that they've put forward, which are all mutually contradictory. Ultimately, the divisions in Project 2025 flow from the class contradictions at the very heart of Trumpism. Trump appeals to traditional petty and big bourgeois conservatives, while at the same time his populist rhetoric against establishment elites has won support from a layer of the working class. But no political movement can faithfully serve two hostile classes with fundamentally opposing interests. And I think nothing shows this better than the Project 2025 suggestion to replace career bureaucrats in the civil service with political appointees. This represents an attempt to return to the old spoils system of the early and mid-19th century, where presidents would reward their political allies with potentially lucrative positions in the federal government. But as the capitalist system developed and became more complex, the capitalists themselves required a more centralized federal administration that was staffed by experts instead of amateurs, and that's why they came up with this civil service in the first place. The idea of shielding these bureaucrats from political pressure was designed to ensure that they were guided by the long-term interests of capital as a whole, not by any whims of public opinion or party policy. And the capitalists are certainly not going to be happy with a return to the old spoils system, and the blowback has already begun. Some of the big funders of heritage, like ExxonMobil and the Walton family of Walmart, have already cut off their financial support. And Paul Dans, who is a co-editor of Project 2025 and co-author specifically of the chapter about the federal bureaucracy, was forced out of the project at the end of July.
So as we can see, yes, it's a hodgepodge of reactionary garbage, but it's not a blueprint for fascism. And by the way, on this question of Trump the dictator on day one, he did say this in an interview in Fox, I believe. Let's watch him say that himself.
Under no circumstances, you are promising America tonight, you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
for?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border, and I want to drill.
That's not retribution. I'm
going to be, he keeps, we love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator, okay?
So yeah, clearly he's unpredictable. He says whatever comes to his mind. He openly jokes about being a dictator for using executive orders. And the liberals hate this, of course, but beyond that, the serious strategists of capital really disapprove of this kind of behavior, not just because of the surface impression, but because it actually risks delegitimizing American capitalist institutions altogether. Things like the presidency, the Constitution. When you have someone that reckless representing these things, it's a destabilizing factor for capitalism. And so they want more responsible people in that office. But one of the really interesting things about our era is that since 2016, the capitalists have essentially lost control of the Republican Party. It used to be firmly in their grip, reliable for decades and decades, but Trump has really taken it over. And we've discussed several times on this podcast why Trump gains an echo. Essentially, American capitalism is in severe decline, and he's really the only person who at least appears as an anti-establishment candidate. And so he's tapping into that anger that's built up over decades.
Yeah, and I mean, like we said, it's like this is a process that really started in the 70s, this decline of U.S. capitalism that has led to a situation where basically workers are feeling it. Wages are down, inflation is high, and there's a deeply felt class anger. There's discontent, and Trump is speaking to this demagogically and confusing it with all kinds of scapegoating and basically saying immigrants are to blame or trans people are to blame or whatever. But he's able to capture that anger because no one else is speaking to that anger. And you can see how, in fact, if you compare this to, the analysis of fascism that we just gave earlier as a means to destroy working class organizing, in this period, what we've also seen is that there's actually a huge increase in support for trade unions. It's at historic or recently historic highs, if you will. It's over 70% approval for unions as an institution, which compared to 10, 20 years ago, it's an all-time high. And the Republican Party has to speak to this at the RNC. I mean, they're really presenting themselves to be the party of the working class. You have, shamefully, people like Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, who spoke at the RNC. J.D. Vance is flaunting his working class credentials. He's a working class kid from, middle of nowhere, America. And so all of this actually shows how this is a distorted expression of working class anger, but also of a rise in working class identity, in people identifying as working class and actually wanting to fight back and organize against the conditions of the system, which is quite different from what we described about fascism earlier.
Definitely. And if you want to see the extent to which Trump consciously taps into this anger, there's a quote from basically one of his last ads, the last ad that his campaign put out in November 2016, right before the election. And in this ad, Trump is speaking, and he says,
"Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. The political establishment has brought about the destruction of our factories and our jobs as they flee to Mexico, China, and other countries all around the world. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities."
He's very aware of this anger. He's consciously tapping into it. In fact, he even said earlier in that campaign privately that he was copying Bernie Sanders's rhetoric to some degree because they have to appeal to the working class to get votes, of course, and he's aware of that.
Now he's actually, it seems to have toned it down a little bit. The drain the swamp, down with the billionaires, I'm going to go in and clean it all up. Part of the thinking of maybe why he's toned it down is, well, he's been in power for 4 years. Of course, he did not drain the swamp. He didn't, fundamentally change things for the working class. But he can't say that in public. That would mean he failed those first 4 years, according to that rhetoric. So anyway, that's just like an interesting thing. But when he was the first coming into the scene, it really upended the political landscape. And the Republicans were scrambling to grapple with this. And of course, you had Bernie Sanders on the other pole, which was a huge pressure on this. Like you said, he was kind of copying that rhetoric as well. Why? Because it worked, and because it actually gained support, it gained an echo, right?
Right. So yeah, and he actually rode that discontent into the White House. Sanders capitulated to the Democrats. Trump actually fought to the end, essentially, and so he made it to the presidency. And from the point of view of the capitalists, it essentially represented a kind of rogue element, an uncontrollable element, getting into the presidency and also gaining control of the Republican Party. Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, described the modern executive state as a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, which is a very good way to put it. But not only are his policies unpredictable, also his public behavior is not what they want to see in a president. Like we talked about, he jokes about being a dictator. He talks about retribution and penalizing political opponents. He openly admires people like Xi Jinping and Putin. And so they don't trust him. They try to control him. They kind of winced through the first 4 years, but they want someone more serious, more reliable. But in any case, too, I mean, all of these traits of his, it's not the decisive question as to whether he's leading a fascist movement. Even if he wanted to implement a dictatorship, he's not in a position to do that. It's not just about his subjective desires, but the relations between the classes, the development of the class struggle, um, the policies of the ruling class, and I think again the example of Germany helps illustrate this. So to go back to Germany in the first half of the 20th century, essentially from 1914 onward, when World War I began, world capitalism was in deep crisis. In fact, World War I signified the very end of capitalism's progressive era. It was an imperialist war, which showed that there was no more um, meaningful expansion for capitalism. And as a result of the crisis created by that war, the Russian working class, which was led by the Bolshevik Party, successfully took power in October 1917. And that revolutionary mood quickly spread throughout Europe. And actually, the bourgeoisie themselves were very aware of this fact. In 1919, the British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, commented, "The whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution." And one of the earliest examples of this revolution was in Germany in November of 1918. It started as a mutiny in the Navy, and it quickly developed into a full-fledged revolutionary movement across the country. The monarchy was overthrown, but the Social Democrats essentially channeled that movement back towards capitalism. And so the immediate result was the formation of kind of an unstable bourgeois democracy. And I would point out, if there had been a Bolshevik organization in place, if there had been a Marxist leadership rooted in the working class of Germany, like there had been in Russia, it's possible that in the immediate period after that, the German working class could have also taken power, spreading the socialist revolution. But in actuality, the Communist Party of Germany was only founded at the end of that year. And so it opened up a period of revolution across Europe.
And yeah, I mean, like you said, it's not just in Germany. You actually had revolutions in Finland right after the Bolsheviks took power in Russia that had an impact there. You had revolutionary movements in Italy. You had a wave of factory occupations where the working class really was flexing its muscles and could have taken power if it had the correct leadership. You had a general strike movement in Britain. I mean, from one country to the next, even in China, 1925, 1927, also there was a revolution there. So it was really a wave of Bolshevism, if you will, of revolutionary struggle of the working class that unfortunately failed to seize powers in those occasions.
Right, yeah. The workers of the world were inspired by the Russian example. They understood what it represented. The same fundamental issues that had impacted the working class in Russia were present everywhere. And so it was a window of opportunity to spread the socialist revolution. But you see basically that the question of leadership is decisive. And so in every other country, the communist leadership was lacking. So basically, over the next 15 years, there were multiple moments in Germany and other countries where the working class could have taken power if it had had a proper communist leadership. 1918, as we discussed, the revolution that broke out then. And also, in particular, in 1923, there was a classic revolutionary situation where the German working class could have taken power, but the KPD was unprepared for it. It was not tested and trained in the way the Bolshevik Party had. It also got bad advice, very bad advice from Zinoviev and Stalin in Moscow, who basically said to be cautious, not to go on the offensive. And so they didn't seize the moment. And in 1923, another opportunity was lost. After that, there was a partial recovery, a partial stabilization of German capitalism until 1929. But then the world slump for capitalism came. And again, that meant total ruin for the small shopkeepers, increased political instability, economic instability. And by this time, over 10 years of this kind of of this period had passed, the capitalists really started to look for a solution to this constant chaos of the post-war period. All these strikes, the demonstrations, the revolutionary upsurges of the last 10 years was interfering with their system, it was interfering with their profits, and they were concerned still about proletarian revolution in a country where capitalism was in such deep crisis and had such an organized working class. And so then and only then, they started to turn towards the fascists. They started to look towards the fascists as an actual solution to their problem. And discussions within the ruling class about backing Hitler began around 1930, 1931 onwards.
Yeah, and so we see again, it's not just about the subjective will of the fascists themselves, who, as you described earlier, were actually a very weak movement to start with, but it's also about the capitalists themselves needing to lean on that fascist movement to finance it and to bring it to power in order to rescue capitalism as a bulwark against the rise of revolutions and the workers' movement. To quote again from the Trotsky piece on fascism and Bonapartism, he said that finance capital possesses the possibility of substituting for each one of its systems of domination that decays another system corresponding better to the changed conditions. And so basically, we would say that bourgeois democracy is a democracy for the capitalists. Therefore, even under democratic system, finance capital is still fundamentally ruling. And this would be the preferred way for the capitalists to rule democracy. I think Trotsky said in another writing that it's the most aristocratic way for the capitalists to rule, because it's much more stable. You can basically paper over the class contradictions in society, but when society is disintegrating, things are really slipping away from the ruling class, then they had to lean on basically fascism for finance capital to stay at the helm, as opposed to the workers themselves taking power. And we should add, of course, that comes with a risk for the capitalists. They wouldn't just want to start wars or fund fascists just for the sake of it, because there's a possibility that things get out of control, which it did. For German capitalism wasn't doing very well, after the war, after World War II, right? Fascism ultimately led to the massacre of World War II, the wholesale destruction of Europe, which was not a very good thing for the German capitalists. And Trotsky also says this. He says that the passage from one system to another signifies the political crisis, which, with the concourse of the activity of the revolutionary proletariat, may be transformed into a social danger to the bourgeoisie. So it can slip out of their control. The fascists themselves could kind of slip out of control, but also it opens up even more instability and open sort of class warfare, where the revolutionary uprising of the working class could also find a way forward.
Right. Fascism, I think, for the ruling class was kind of like getting a tooth pulled. It's not something that they wanted to do. It's viewed as a last resort. But if you have to do it, obviously they were going to go through with it. And so Hitler convinced them that the Nazi movement was the best way of assuring stability. And so in the early 1930s, the heads of all the major industries started lavishly funding Hitler. Hitler himself actually commented later that he said, "Without automobiles, airplanes, and loudspeakers, we could not have conquered Germany. These three technical means enabled National Socialism, Nazism, to carry on an amazing campaign." And he was speaking to the fact that they needed the funding in order to build the Nazi movement. Throughout this period, too, there was a series of of unstable Bonapartist governments. The economic situation continued to deteriorate, and so there were meetings, there were discussions. In fact, eventually, a meeting was held on January 4th, 1933, at the home of a banker, Schroeder, where the decision to hand over power to Hitler was made. And he later wrote about this. So this is coming from a major German banker relating this meeting. He said, "This meeting between Hitler and Papen on January 4th, 1933, in my house in Cologne, was arranged by me after Papen had asked me for it on about December 10th, 1932. Before I took this step, I talked to a number of businessmen and informed myself generally on how the business world viewed a collaboration between the two men. The general desire of businessmen was to see a strong man come to power in Germany who would form a government that would stay in power for a long time." And so I think that shows as explicitly as possible from the German capitalists at the time that it was viewed as a necessity. It was a conscious turn towards the fascists. And by the way, compare that to the way the capitalists feel about Trump today. They do, as always, the capitalists will donate to both campaigns in a lot of cases because they want to be prepared to cash in favors. But recently, there was a very interesting piece in the New York Times. This is from June 23rd of this year by a business professor at Yale named Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. And the title of this piece was, "I Know What America's Leading CEOs Really Think of Donald Trump." And he basically says, he spells out, recent headlines suggests that our nation's business leaders are embracing the presidential candidate Donald Trump. And he goes on to say, that's far from the truth. They didn't flock to him before, and they certainly aren't flocking to him now. He says, I know this because I work with roughly 1,000 chief executives a year, running a school for them, which I started 35 years ago, and I speak with business leaders almost every day. Our surveys show that 60 to 70% of them are registered Republicans. And he also clarifies, he points out that not a single Fortune 100 chief executive has donated to Trump so far as of June, which is a major break from tradition of overwhelming business support for Republican presidential candidates. And so in another article at the time too, I think he spelled it out. He said CEOs want stability, they want predictability, they want clarity on what kind of political and economic environment they're going to operate in, and they don't see Trump as someone who can deliver that. So it's a very different situation in that respect too.
I would say it's also worth noting, going back to the historical example with Germany, that the Social Democrats had supported Hindenburg, who was the president of Germany at the time, basically, as a lesser evil. They said basically Hindenburg is the lesser evil compared to the right wing. But then Hindenburg actually ceded power to fascism, to Hitler, which I think is a good way to show how that lesser evil argument of voting fascism out, even today, if Trump were a fascist, that would not work. Hindenburg personally didn't actually like Hitler or fascism, but he was told by the finance capitalists, by the capitalists, like, sorry, buddy, this is our pick. This is who's going to be next. And he had to just cede the baton because he served the interest of the capitalists, as Kamala and the Democrats do today. And of course, as the Republicans do. There's no question about that.
Right, yeah. I mean, essentially the capitalists would have told Hindenburg, this is what needs to happen. It's not about his own preference, but the capitalists as a whole had decided that was necessary. Same in the instance of Spain too. Some people were arguing that we need to fight fascism first, fight for a republic, and then we can fight for the socialist revolution. Trotsky pointed out, well, what liberal bourgeoisie are you talking about when you say what we need to have a republic? Yes, we would prefer a republic to fascism, but by that point, by 1936 onwards, the Spanish capitalists had decided fascism was necessary and they had swung fully behind Franco. And so, all of these different examples illustrate the class character of fascism and the degree to which the capitalists were conscious of that.
By the way, there's also many examples from the rest of Europe. The representatives of capitalism were very cozy to the fascists, to Mussolini, even to Hitler. For example, Prime Minister Churchill, which today is seen as this respected figure who fought in World War II against the Nazis, actually supported fascism against the rise of the working class and the revolutionary wave. When he visited Italy in 1927, he said about Mussolini, "If I had been Italian, I am sure I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism." So basically saying to Mussolini, if I were Italian, I would have absolutely 100% been behind you. He also said that in the conflict between fascism and Bolshevism, there was no doubt where my sympathies and convictions lay. He also similarly said that he supported Hitler. He said that he appreciated Hitler's courage and vital force and so forth, which again, just very starkly reveals how at the time, for the capitalists and their representatives, it was a question of choosing between revolution and losing power altogether, losing all of their profits, losing control of the economy, or of backing the fascists against Bolshevism, against the working class revolution, and at least maintain at least maintain control of the economy, even though there was a potential risk of things getting a little bit out of control there with fascism.
Right, definitely, and even and they had to wait, or they had to be in a situation where the workers' movement was sufficiently exhausted and demoralized to even make that happen. I think we should also add, like, another aspect of this whole history was the false policy of the workers' organizations, particularly the Communist International. For context, by the mid 1920s, the Soviet Union had begun to degenerate into a Stalinist, bureaucratic workers' state, and this had refracted into the Communist International as well. And so the Comintern was transformed into an appendage of the Stalinist Soviet Union, and they made a number of serious policy errors really for the rest of their existence. And in this particular case, from 1929 onwards, they had an ultra left policy of attacking not the fascists, not the capitalists and the right wing, but the social democrats as the main enemy of the workers. And in fact, they even said the social democrats are, in essence, social fascists. Stalin famously said that social democracy and fascism are twins. And so the policy of the German KPD was to constantly attack the SPD, to call them social fascists. That was what they were emphasizing. This also led to another issue, which is that they had essentially watered down the meaning of the word fascism by calling everything fascist. All kinds of regimes were characterized with the Communist International as fascist at this time. And Trotsky was writing about this. He was arguing, well, the Nazis are something fundamentally different than what had come before. That was not fascism. But this actually is fascism. This is going to mean not just another period of a right-wing Bonapartist dictatorship, but actually the dismantling of the labor movement, as we described.
And so that really shows you can't just like cry wolf, every time that you see something reactionary, call it fascism, and that can actually disarm the movement in the face of actual fascism. That's the problem with just throwing around the word as an insult. Sometimes people will just be like, oh, fascist this and fascist that, and it's really just used as a moral disparaging someone who's right wing or who's authoritarian or something. But this really highlights the need for precision. Another element to this is if we see the big picture. Like we said, the working class had many, many, many opportunities to take power. They rose up, they fought courageously in multiple occasions throughout all of Europe. And it was only on the back of multiple defeats and therefore demoralization, partial paralysis, of course, impoverished conditions throughout Europe due to the crisis of the system, and then the absolute crushing of workers through the fascist gangs, that fascism backed by the capitalists was really able to finally really take over. And that is very different from the situation in the United States today.
The working class in the US and worldwide is not exhausted and defeated after years or decades of revolutionary struggle. On the contrary, the US working class is just starting to wake up after decades of slumber. And especially since 2008, capitalism has been in a deep organic crisis. This has led to a collapse of the political center across the world as people look for a way out. And if Sanders had pursued a class-independent policy in 2016 or 2020, if he had stood up to the capitalist Democratic Party and for instance, launched an independent campaign, launched an independent party, this discontent, this class anger that has built up in the US could have been channeled to the left. It could have been channeled in the direction of building a workers' organization. Because he capitulated, that left Trump as the only remaining anti-establishment option. And he was, as we discussed, he was insincere. He was manipulating people. But in the contrast, given the choice between Clinton, who is openly saying we're going to continue Obama's legacy, she was really clearly putting herself forward as the continuation of Obama, versus Trump, who is saying we need to drain the swamp, who is saying that the wealth of this country has been robbed from us. That he was seen as an alternative. He was seen as a lesser evil or someone to try voting for to break this logjam.
Yeah, and your article had a lot of great statistics about what the post-war boom represented and why it had such a big impact on the consciousness of the American workers. Because after World War II, the U.S. produced 43% of the world's manufactured goods, 57% of the world's steel, 80% of the world's cars. And really what we saw was the biggest economic upswing in the history of capitalism, and for the US in particular, which combined with a massive strike wave after World War II, meant that wages were relatively high, conditions were good, benefits like pensions and health insurance were introduced, unemployment was low, and of course, since then we know all of that has greatly declined, sharply declined. One statistic I found particularly vivid is that from 1900 to 1973, real wages had steadily grown at an average rate of 2%, which in practice meant that every 35 years, real wages were doubling for workers in the US. But all of that changed from 1973 onward. Basically, by 1990, the average real wage of a production worker was less than 85% what it was in 1973. So real wages have stagnated or actually decreased compared to that period. And this is what has led to this class anger, class discontent that Trump is tapping into. There was a quote of a UAW worker in your article. Let me see if I can find it here. This is an interview with the Wall Street Journal. Ford worker, UAW union worker, who said about Trump's campaign in 2016, "I knew the Democrats had left working class people in the 90s. Trump's no genius. He just realized what was going on in the country and had the courage to stand up to these people." So basically, he's saying that none of these the policies of the past were helping working class people. That's the sentiment, which, of course, again, finds a very distorted expression because it's channeled into anti-immigrant rhetoric, climate change denial, all these kinds of things, right? But in essence, it's a working class anger, working class discontent. And I think that's, if you think about the slogan, "Make America Great Again," it's basically saying, let's go back to the good old days of American capitalism, where people would just hang out and go to diners and be able to afford the price of an omelet, and there's Coca-Cola ads. People are just having, and you have cars and a house that you can afford, right? All these things. Make America Great Again means this. And it's worth pointing out, you mentioned earlier how the ruling class has really lost control of the Republicans. In the past, there was a lot of more internal struggles within the Republicans, the people that want Trump out, never Trumper kind of Republicans. Some of them spoke at the DNC the other week. There's also anyway, different sort of struggles within the party, but now it's really under the firm grip of Trump. And part of that, you can see the official platform of the Republican Party is titled "Make America Great Again." And it's full of Trumpisms. If people want to have a laugh, you can check it out. It's got things in all caps. And, if you've seen Trump's tweets, kind of evoke some of that. But I think it really shows how the Democrats are the party of the establishment of the ruling class. Of course, the Republicans also represent capitalist interests, but it's a bit more of a maverick situation because, as we know, Trump kind of just cares about himself, about not going to jail, and about making good deals for himself and his buddies. But Kamala and Biden, before he was senile, I think would have been a much, much safer pair of hands.
Definitely. And if you look at his first term, it's clear that the capitalists were constantly trying to curb him and to contain him. They weren't encouraging him with these antics, with these empty utopian promises and his whole approach. They were just trying to manage the situation of having him in the White House. This process, I think, is revealed very clearly when you look at the 2020 George Floyd uprising, when you had 16 to 27 million people, according to the estimate, in the streets. It was a mass movement, 2,000 cities where this movement came to. It was prompted, of course, by the murder of George Floyd, but it really was tapping into years of accumulated discontent. And Trump basically took the opportunity to kind of bluster as a strongman. He called on the governors to call in the National Guard. He said to them, "We're going to clamp down very, very strong. The word is dominate. And if you don't dominate in your city and your state, they're going to walk away with you." So he said, "We're going to have total domination." He also said he strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets.
And by the way, Tim Walz famously did heed Trump's advice and sent in the National Guard at the time where he was governor of Minnesota. So much so that Trump actually, I think there were leaked audios that show that Trump was very happy with Walz. He said, "I was very happy with the last couple of days, Tim. You called up big numbers, and the big numbers knocked them out so fast, it was like bowling pins," describing the repression of the National Guard of the BLM movement. So if being a strong man and sending in the National Guard is proof of fascism, I guess Tim Walz would also
Right.
be a fascist.
Yeah. And so after that advice to the governors, he also said that if cities or states fail to do this, he said, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them, which was a very dramatic development at the time. But this threat actually opened up a profound rift within the upper layers of the state. Immediately, there was an article in CNN, and it reported that there was deep and it said defense officials tell CNN there was deep and growing discomfort among some in the Pentagon even before President Donald Trump announced Monday that he's ready to deploy the military to enforce order inside the United States. In the coming days, Trump's former defense secretary, James Mattis, also intervened. He wrote an article in The Atlantic essentially describing Trump as a threat to the Constitution and was calling for him to be removed. The former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, retired Admiral Mike Mullen, also chimed in along these lines. John Allen, a retired four-star Marine general, spoke out against it. And then his then current defense secretary, Mark Esper, publicly spoke out about his opposition to Trump's threats to invoke the Insurrection Act. So Trump's defense secretary was openly contradicting Trump. Long story short, once Trump made that threat to call in the military, basically there was a clear struggle in the White House and the Pentagon to stop Trump. Additionally, by the way, the major mouthpieces of the ruling class chimed in on this. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal published an article just called "Don't Call in the Troops." And they explained Trump has the right to do this, but we really don't think that's the correct move. And basically, these people understood that calling in the military in this instance would be extremely risky. It's not something to play with from their point of view. For one thing, it could pour more fuel on the fire of the protests. It was not at all necessarily going to just halt the George Floyd movement, but also it could risk even partial fracturing, a breakdown of discipline within the military itself. Trump's presidency had already undermined capitalist institutions generally, and they certainly did not want to worsen that by further undermining the Constitution itself.
This is, I think, one more example of how it's not just about whatever pops into Trump's mind and he just does whatever he wants. If he wanted to be a dictator, he's a dictator and whatever. I mean, there's a whole apparatus of American bourgeois democracy, different institutions of the state and the capitalists themselves that can, basically oppose wild moves that would really endanger the foundations of American capitalism and American stability. And they're really worried about how a Trump presidency could further destabilize things once again. I think in a previous episode, we already quoted an op-ed by this right-wing conservative, Bret Stephens. The article is titled "Republicans Will Regret a Second Trump Term." And it describes how some of these bombastic claims, like we're going to have mass deportation, that something like this could actually split society again, could cause riots, could cause mass protests. There could be government officials that refuse to carry out the orders and so forth, and how basically this risks strengthening the left wing, actually, and to just fan the flames of revolutionary anger in the United States. And this question of immigration, too, I mean, I think that's another big argument that gets used to say, like, well, Trump threatens to really, clamp down against immigrants, against, oppressed people in the U.S. This gets used to say, well, that's fascism.
Right. People look at this, definitely an increase in scapegoating immigrants and, the Trump's threats for mass deportation, which is obviously disgusting reactionary rhetoric he's using. But yeah, they use that as another argument that this is a coming fascist regime. But we should clarify, this has always been present under capitalism, even by, esteemed bourgeois democratic politicians. the capitalists over centuries have made use of scapegoating, of divide and rule tactics, of blaming immigrants and other oppressed groups for the problems of society. And so I think as capitalism enters into deeper crisis, we're seeing an increase, a reemergence of this kind of thing in the U.S. But it's part and parcel of capitalism in general.
Yeah, and we already commented in previous episodes how now Harris herself is, presenting herself as being tough on the border. She famously said, "Don't come to immigrants." She went to Guatemala and expressly said, "Do not come. We do not want you here." I mean, this rhetoric is used on the quote unquote left, right, by the liberals and by the Republicans to different degrees, and the rhetoric can of course be a bit more exaggerated on Trump's side. Other things, sometimes this question of cop cities, such as in Atlanta, the increase in police budgets, all of this is a sign that we're falling into authoritarian fascism, whatever. We should point out too, by the way, this is just, these are the bodies of armed men of the state under whether it's bourgeois democracy or any other form of system. But it's not just under the Republicans. A lot of these, like there's now talk that there's going to be another cop city, basically police mass training facility here in New York City, which is a Democratic stronghold. And a lot of the cities that increase police budgets are Democratic Party cities, right? So, and none of this is proof that, or the genocide in Gaza, does that mean that it's fascism? Well, no, that's just imperialism, which is itself a feature of capitalist rule in this day and age. So all of these things, we don't have to basically exaggerate it, say it's fascism. We can use the scientific term. That's just what capitalism is. It's repression, it's oppression, it's exploitation for the vast majority of the working class. And another one too, of course, January 6th was another big turning point in terms of pointing out Trump's risks to democracy. And that was basically an attempted fascist coup.
Right. For like 3 years now, the liberals have been constantly evoking this to make that argument. So it's definitely worth looking at what that actually was. And to give context, of course, Trump lost the 2020 election basically due to the extent of anti-Trump sentiment. There's millions of people voted for Biden as the lesser evil, and Biden won on that basis. But Trump, in keeping with his character, wanted to stay in power. He tried different legal avenues. He was blocked at every point. For instance, he even at the end called on Mike Pence to overturn the election, which he thought was possible. And then this was actually the final straw for Pence, who had put up with all of this stuff for 4 years, but broke with Trump for good after January 6th. And so eventually, after Trump was blocked in the courts, he decided to just kind of play with fire and call this demonstration, this Save America demonstration outside the Capitol. And we should be aware of the numbers and what this actually represented. Because, for instance, there's different estimates I found, but basically somewhere between 10,000 and 53,000 of the most diehard Trump supporters from across the country who planned these trips over weeks and weeks assembled. That was their show of force, which in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the population, over 330 million people, if you look at, I think, over 70 million who voted for Trump, it's a small sliver of his diehard core. So that's the people that were at the rally. And then of those 10 or 50,000 or so, estimates range from 2,000 to 2,500 who actually entered the Capitol. And it was very clear, if you look at the photos, watch the footage, once they actually breached the Capitol, there was no clear plan. They had no basis for taking power. They had delusions of grandeur. They thought it was like a 1776 moment, but in reality, they just kind of walked around. It was a riot, a mob, and then eventually, law enforcement cleared it out.
And if you compare those numbers, whatever it was, 2,000, 3,000 who actually entered the Capitol, even the larger figures of the Trump rally, even if you take the 50,000, compare that to the Black Lives Matter movement that had just taken place, in the months leading up to this, where over 20 million people poured into the streets of every single major American city and non-major, even small towns. You had Black Lives Matter protests. So that really shows you the balance of forces. Sometimes there's this thing that gets said, right? Well, America is slipping into fascism because everyone is a right winger now, and the right wing is so strong. Well, actually, if you look at that, the protest of the left wing, the Black Lives Matter movement, all this, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people compared to just a few thousand, really, on the Trump side.
Right. And even at the peak of that movement too, beyond just the tens of millions that were in the streets, it had like a huge majority of support from the U.S. population when it was at its when it was at its height. And so, anyway, yeah, very different situation from January 6th. While this was happening, Trump was silent at first, but obviously the pressure was put on him to call it off. And so a couple hours later, he ended up publishing a video. He told the rioters, "We love you. You are very special, but you have to go home now. We have to have peace." And so it was clear that if you look at every angle of January 6th, Trump did not have the support of any visible wing of the capitalist class. It was unanimously renounced by all major businesses, business leaders, politicians, even the pro-Trump politicians. They could kind of toe the line and say that the election was stolen, but actually coming out in favor of January 6th itself was like a line that no one else was prepared to cross. In terms of like military support for this too, we can point out just 3 days before, when this was starting to develop, the 10 living former defense secretaries published a joint op-ed in the Washington Post defending the election results, defending Joe Biden's victory, and explaining that involving the military in the transfer of power, quote, would take us into dangerous, unlawful, and unconstitutional territory. And so we pointed out at the time that if the military were to be called in, it would be to get rid of Trump, not to install him as a dictator. In terms of business response too, that's another key measure to look at. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce denounced it. The National Association of Manufacturers, which represents 14,000 major corporations, denounced it and even urged Vice President Pence to, quote, seriously consider impeaching Trump before his term ended. That was the extent of their disapproval for this adventure. And by the way, too, this Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who we quoted from earlier, at the time, he convened a call of 33 top executives to discuss how business should respond. And he said that there was, quote, universal outrage, unquote, among this group that usually spanned the political spectrum. And so, of course, the ruling class is not a monolithic block. We're not saying that there's zero CEOs, zero billionaires who are Trump supporters. But clearly, when it came to January 6th, when it came to just open adventures to destabilize U.S. bourgeois democracy, they were firmly against it. They want to maintain and re-legitimize the system, not unravel it by these kinds of antics that Trump was pursuing.
Mm-hmm. And you could see by the statements he made that Trump was trying to kind of maintain his base of support while also distancing himself from the more dangerous sides of January 6th, for example. He said, I love you, you're great, that classic Trumpist kind of rhetoric. But the thing is, we're not denying that there are absolutely far-right elements, fascist elements and groups, gangs in the country. What we're talking about is that these are not by any means a mass movement. They're actually very small groups that do not have a lot of influence. Of course, as small groups of fascists can represent a risk to individuals or to small groups of people. We don't deny that. If you have a gang of fascists that runs into, say, an immigrant worker, could those shoot them or hit this person or racist, attacks? Or of course, this can happen, but that doesn't mean it's a mass movement to do this on a mass systematic scale along the lines of what we saw in, say, Germany in the 30s or Spain or Italy. And this was exemplified, of course, the liberals would talk about how Trump says, I think in a debate in the 2020 election, in a debate, Trump directly addressed the Proud Boys and he said, what did he say?
Stand back and stand by, I think.
Stand back and stand by, as if he controls the Proud Boys, say, okay, you're good, but for now, don't do anything, kind of a thing. So yeah, of course, Trump leans on these elements. He also leaned on QAnon, conspiracy theorists, and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that you can unleash a mass movement, because a mass movement for fascism does not exist. And you could see this clearly. For example, in 2017, you had these famous marches of the right wing in Charlottesville. Famously, there was a protester who was socialist protesting in a counter protest against the far right, who was killed by a car plowing into a crowd. And this unleashed a wave of counter protests that way outnumbered the far right. In Boston, I think you had an attempt to have a Unite the Right kind of rally repeat a few weeks after Charlottesville. And I think the right wing actually mustered like a little group of 40, 50 people with a massive crowd of over 10,000 surrounding them, and the cops kind of protecting the fascists, So it really shows that in those circumstances, there is a massive potential for a response for the working class to pour into the streets and fight these very, very tiny far right fascist threats. In Britain, very recently, just a few weeks ago, there was a wave of far right violence, fascist violence, anti-immigrant violence, which we should point out, it was stoked certainly by anti-immigrant rhetoric that was coming from the Tory party, the right-wing party, the nationalist British party, but also from the so-called left Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, who, like Kamala Harris, was saying we're going to be tough on the border, we don't want immigration, and so forth. So that absolutely fed the right-wing thugs who went out and they were going, just to give you an example, they would go from car to car and see the color of the skin of people and take them out and beat them up, that kind of a thing. But then you had a wave of people pouring out into the streets to protest this, to defend the immigrant communities and to defend the working class. So you can see also in this case, it wasn't a matter of voting for the sort of lesser evil labor leader that would prevent the rise of right-wing violence, but rather of mass working class resistance and working class organization to create the defense of the oppressed people that were being brutalized by these gangs. But again, it just reveals that the balance of forces here. We're talking about a few hundred, a few thousand versus tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that would potentially come out to protest and mobilize against that kind of threat.
Right, and we can add too, like that was exactly what was needed. When we were arguing that fascism is not on the verge of taking state power, but if there is this individual fascist attacks, then the labor movement needs to respond to that. Workers and youth need to respond to that and drive these people away. And so, and there's clearly a basis for that, as you mentioned. So, yeah, the labor movement, I would say, needs to nip it in the bud where it emerges, while also maintaining a sense of proportion about where history is headed in a broader sense. And this point on the balance of forces is another important element to consider when we talk about fascism and compare, say, Germany, Spain, and Italy versus the situation today. Because as we talked about a bit earlier, the reason that those regimes were able to be so stable in their early years, the reason that they were able to just completely clamp down and dismantle the organized workers movement is because they had this mass base of enraged small shopkeepers, peasants, students, declassed layers of society. They mobilized these people. And Trotsky pointed out, fascism is unique because it's a form of reaction that has a mass base. And so the fascists mobilized these layers, especially the enraged petty bourgeoisie, the small business owners, small shopkeepers. But today, that layer of society is much smaller. The continuation of capitalism has proletarianized more and more layers of society. One estimate, by the way, which was published in The Guardian in 2018, suggested that just around 7.8 million people work for their own small businesses in the United States. The workforce itself is 160 million, and so that would suggest that just under 5% of the workforce today are small business owners and those kinds of layers. Also, if you look at students, that also has become drastically more proletarianized over the decades versus the situation in Germany, Spain, Italy, really all of Europe at that time. Back then, the students were a much smaller layer of society. It was private, much more kind of like upper class thing. But due to the way capitalism developed, the rise of white collar work and this kind of thing, I call it the vast majority of universities are proletarianized layers of students who are attending university. And lastly, too, there is no peasantry at all in the U.S. And in the advanced capitalist countries generally. which is another difference. And so there's been a lot of changes in the class composition of society since the 1930s. And the point that we draw from that is that the working class is numerically stronger than ever. It's potentially more powerful than ever. It's never been as great of a share of society.
Absolutely. So we have a potentially more powerful and larger working class than ever before in history. And as we mentioned earlier, actually, we're starting to see for the first time in many, many decades, a revival of labor struggles, unionizations, and so forth. So our perspective is not a pessimistic one where we're headed to a far right slump and we're headed to fascism. And all we have to do now is kind of wait out for a period of reaction. It's the contrary. We're optimistic that we're living through a revival, not just of trade union consciousness, but also of revolutionary consciousness. I mean, we've been talking about how there's so many people out there that are receptive to our message of down with the Democrats and with the Republicans and the need to build a communist party. I mean, there's millions and tens of millions of people out there that want to help us in this fight to build a working class alternative to Trump and to the Democrats. And I think it's for this reason that it's important that we take a sober view of what Trumpism represents, because we are absolutely optimistic for the prospects now within the next decades that the working class can organize, can fight back against Trumpism, against the Democrats, against the Republicans, and effectively fight for a government of our own, a government of the workers, and for a communist society.
Right. And so I think when it comes to considering how to fight Trump, really, we have to first recognize what it represents. It's an indication of the political instability. It's, in a distorted way, it's an expression of the fact that people want an option that's going to fight against the establishment, against capitalism, whether they're conscious of that or not. But on the left, the leadership is extremely lacking. For instance, we talked earlier about the fact that I think the most recent figure might be that 71% of Americans have a positive view of trade unions. And yet, from 2022 to 2023, the number of people actually in trade unions basically stayed the same. And so I think that's one example, in addition to things like the capitulation of Bernie Sanders, it's one example of the fact that you have a working class that's starting to become conscious of its power and desire to fight, but a leadership that is not up to the task, that's not actually going for it, that's not actually expanding the labor movement, that's not actually going on the offensive. And so that shows our task over the next period is to build a militant leadership for the working class, starting by assembling the people who have already drawn the conclusion, not just that we need trade unions, not just that we need more strikes, but that we need a revolution, that we need to build a communist party. There's tens and tens of thousands of people with that sentiment. And so if we organize that layer now, we will be in a position to then take these ideas to an increasingly radicalized labor movement as that continues to pan out over the coming years. And on that basis, we'd be able to reframe the polarization in US society, because the real enemy, the real collective enemy of the working class is the capitalist system itself. Right now, some layers of the working class are being ceded to the right wing, but by building a strong, cohesive class leadership, a communist leadership, we can clarify what the real problem is.